Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Coach's Corner University podcast. I am your host, Paul O'Need. And if you're wondering why the background's a little bit different, this is the first podcast we're doing after my injury. So I competed July 13th in a powerlifting meet. As I put out on my YouTube channel and my Instagram, I was training for that. It's kind of a tune-up for my final powerlifting meet that I was planning on doing in December. Unfortunately, my third attempt squat didn't go the way that I planned, lost my balance, and tore both my quads. So I am currently in a hospital bed in my house and in the process of recovering. I'm almost 3 weeks post-surgery. Things are going really well, hence why getting back to normal. And I figured what better way to get back to normal than to have one of my best friends and someone who's been friends with me and with me through so much stuff in my life and started Coach's Corner University with me as well, Tony Montgomery. Tony,
What's
welcome to
up,
the
man?
podcast, man.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me. Appreciate it. Feels like old times, like it's meant to be.
It is. And I was like, I canceled a bunch of podcasts because I had 3 or 4 booked every week. And I was like, I need to get Tony back on first. That needs to be the first one we do. Because I think it's number one. I have a feeling this podcast is going to be more about life than it is about coaching or science or anything like that, because it's just the types of conversations that we have. And I really appreciate your perspective on things, especially hard things, because those are the things that you actively seek out in your day to day. And I think most people shy away from. So I figured this is one of the hardest things that I've ever been through. So why not chat about it with you?
Yeah, for sure. And training and that type of stuff is kind of boring anyways once you get down to it, right?
It's so true. It's
Like
so true.
especially the science behind training and the literature that comes out, and especially with like strength training and hypertrophy training, it's just so I don't know. It's just not good, for lack of a better term. Like I just don't find it to be very appealing. And now being in research myself and seeing how research is conducted, the carryover, the transfer seems so disconnected that I wouldn't really take anything that the research says with too much relevance, especially when it comes to athletes trying to perform at a high level. And then I just see it get disseminated in a way that's so unnuanced that it just makes it very not fun to talk about. It's just like it's just not a lot of curiosity, not a lot of creative thought processes go on when it comes to that stuff. And so, yeah, it's just not fun to talk about.
So you alluded to it, but maybe give everyone kind of an update on where you're at now. Because, you stepped away from Coach's Corner. You were doing your PhD. You were doing your PhD before you stepped away, but things got a bit busy. Maybe let people know what you've been up to. You've published a few papers since then. Like you've been doing some cool shit. So
No, I
tell us about
appreciate that. Yeah. So I'm at Oklahoma State University, going into my third year of my PhD, working on my dissertation. And I've switched fields of study, fields of interest, focusing more on the mental health aspect of things, looking at ways to improve depression, anxiety, PTSD, looking at mechanisms through the lens of neuroscience, through the lens of CBT type training, and then also through the lens of exercise, and trying to see how we can put all those things together to improve mental health disorders in populations that suffer for them, and hopefully specifically looking into more dealing with veterans who suffer from depression and PTSD, because being a vet myself and having friends that have dealt with that just hits closer to home. So I feel like that is a little bit more meaningful to me. And I feel like if it's applicable to veterans, it could be applicable to anyone. So right now, my research is my next 3 studies, one that I'm currently doing, and the next 2 are going to be focusing on utilizing aerobic exercise. And we can talk about why that is if you want to, over resistance exercise, and using that in conjunction with perception shifts. So thinking about cognitive reappraisal, growth mindset, interventions to improve not only the outcome of performance, but also motivation to exercise, exercise adherence, and mood states in general. Because when you look at the research, it clearly shows that exercise is just as beneficial to improving mental health disorders as pharmacology and as CBT treatment, therapy treatments, just as effective, not necessarily more effective. A lot of nuance to that, right? Like for certain types of individuals, certain drugs will work better, certain therapies work better, certain exercise work better. So I'm not going to come on here and say that exercise is the end all be all. It's a healthy approach, but the idea of trying to get somebody with mental health disorders to start exercising and do it on a consistent basis is also a very hard situation to
Huge
overcome.
ask.
Yeah, and that's where my exercise and my research is looking at right now in terms of what we're capable of looking at. I am thinking about getting a postdoc to where I can look at more of the neuroscience side of things, maybe a postdoc in optogenetics, which will allow you to look at the mechanisms and the neurons that are responsible for depression. And we could talk about optogenetics research and all that if you want to. But yeah, so right now, the study that I'm currently doing is putting two groups together. Intervention group is going to be doing cognitive reappraisal, which is the idea of taking any type of negative emotion, negative affect that the subject starts to feel and starts to be overcome with during an exhaustive aerobic exercise. We're trying to switch that to more of a positive affect, shift towards thinking about exercise as being able to endure the pain aspect of it as a positive thing, as opposed to a negative thing, and being able to endure the boring aspect of aerobic exercise as well, right? And trying to shift their mindset to a more positive one when those negative affects come about, when those negative emotions come about. So we're constantly motivating the group and reminding them to shift that appraisal to a more positive aspect. And as of right now, we've gone through 15 subjects, and the results have shown pretty good results for the intervention based group, as opposed to the other group. They're just getting constant motivation during the aerobic exercise. So they're doing time to exhaustion trials based off of FTP, which is their functional threshold power output. And they're going around the realm of like 10 to 20 minutes of aerobic exercise on the bike. And again, using those cognitive reappraisal techniques. And what we're doing with that is afterwards, we're giving them questionnaires in the beginning. So we're giving them questionnaires, mood questionnaires, subjective questionnaires, and then 3 weeks follow up, 6 weeks follow up. We're giving them similar questionnaires, looking at exercise adherence, looking at improvements in mood, and seeing if one group is better than the other. We're also measuring HRV as well, because low markers of HRV have been strongly correlated with depression and PTSD. The lower your HRV is, the greater your rates of depression and PTSD and anxiety are. So we're doing baseline measurements each day of HRV, exercise measurements of HRV, and then post-exercise measurements of HRV as well.
Dude, like when you started talking about the shift, all I was thinking about was number one, you being a veteran and there being a close link. And I find it just provides so much more purpose when you yourself are actively invested in the area of study that you're studying.
Yeah.
But then not only that, you've also had a shift in your own training where you're an aerobic athlete now, right? So you're
Mhm.
competing and you did a 100-mile race, didn't you?
Yeah, last year.
Yeah. So, I mean, going from squatting 800 to running 100 miles, it's a pretty significant shift. And you started your PhD mostly doing like BFR stuff.
Yes and no. My original idea with my PhD was to look at the psychological effects of fatigue.
Okay.
Again, going back to the military
Okay. So
aspect.
it's somewhat similar. Somewhat similar.
Yeah, somewhat similar. When I arrived at OK State, they were actually doing some BFR research, and I was asked to be a part of it. So I accepted, and that's why that research came out first. And that was looking at motor units and um, things that, like, I don't know. It's like you get the answers to, and you're like, yeah, like what practical application does that have? Yeah, exactly. Yeah, one of my good friends, Alex, he just graduated. He took a job up at Virginia, and his whole thing is looking at strength versus hypertrophy and motor unit application. And again, it's like you get these answers and it's like what do you do with it? And it, for me, that lacks meaning, that lacks purpose, and it doesn't feel like it's actually giving people answers to things. It's like, and it doesn't even raise curious questions of like, how can we develop strategies to move forward? So, someone that's like passionate about that, he himself is trying to think of better ways to create research that answers questions that are more applicable, as opposed to these mechanisms that don't really translate into your ability to create interventions to improve those mechanisms.
Because ultimately that's the goal, right? Like if you can't if you can't create an intervention to solve a problem, but you know what the answer to the problem is, you just can't get there in the real world. What
You think
exactly
that's the
are we doing?
goal?
I feel like a lot of research these days, having been like, obviously I have a post grad degree, not a PhD, but I have two. I feel like a lot of research is done just for the sake of doing research.
Unfortunately, yeah. That's something that I've come to see, and those are always the best conversations to have, because you just ask them immediately, like, "So, what's the point of this research?" And you don't get a lot of really good answers other than like, "I just thought it would be cool to get an answer to this question." I'm like, hey, teach their own. I want to do something a little bit more meaningful with what I want to do, meaningful for me, right?
Yep.
Not maybe meaningful for them and what they're looking at, but um yeah.
The other thing that came to my mind when you were talking about the shift, you mentioned how it's just not fun to talk about research. It's also not realistic to look at research and then try to apply it to the real world. And you and I have spoken about this on a lot of our past podcasts, in that when you get to the fringe levels of performance, the rules don't apply.
Yeah.
And I say rules, but they're really not even rules. They're just things we think are rules. And I feel as though the current climate around people getting their education from social media, 90-second clips and that sort of thing, it's much easier to say, do this, not this, or this is right, that is wrong. When even in the global like viewpoint of the research, the average is presented. So even within a study, you're going to have people that responded and didn't respond. But if the on average most people responded, that's the right answer.
Right.
So
And
how when you're speaking, especially like you still coach clients, like you're still a strength coach. When you're talking to your clients and talking to people about, this is why we're doing this, this is why we're using this intervention over something that may be contrary to what the research says, how do you have those conversations?
yeah, so I use a lot of just experience working with clients and seeing what has worked in the past, and then also just troubleshooting, right? Like, you have this baseline of understanding of this is how we make progress. And the best way to make progress is to train to a certain level that allows you to recover from that, right? So it's a constant back and forth with the clients of, hey, do you feel like you're recovering? Do you feel like we have enough specificity? And that's where you make those adjustments, right? That's where you can push that envelope back and forth of what you should be doing versus what you shouldn't be doing. So it's that idea of trying to understand that allostatic load that they have from life stresses, from sleep, nutrition. Are they in a cut? Are they in a surplus? What's the goal of the training? And then looking at the aspects of the training and trying to figure out what's working and what's not working. So that's kind of where I go with them, is constantly trying to evaluate how they feel their progress is coming about, and how they feel their body is recovering from it. And then that's when you can kind of look at the research to help guide, intelligently make those decisions, right? If they feel like they're having a hard time recovering, then we kind of know based on the research that that's going to be a volume, that's going to be a need to reduce volume, right? But we don't want to do reduce volume and specificity, because we know specificity gives us the best results when it comes to strength sports. So we try to reduce volume in accessories, and then we see in 2 or 3 weeks, are we able to make progress? And if the main movements start going up again, then you solve the problem. If they don't go up, then you try to find a different answer to the problem, right? And that's constantly what you're doing, going back and forth. So it's really just about understanding the baseline of like, this is what the person has been doing with success. This is what we will continue to do. And then we will evaluate every week to see if we're making progress or not, as opposed to following these strict standards of, X amount of volume per week gives you X amount, and you should be within this range, and you should be doing, X amount in main lifts and then a certain amount in accessories. Like, none of that really matters when you're dealing with human beings, because it's irrelevant, right? And then kind of back to what you were saying in general with the idea, even within psychology, because that's what I focus a lot on now, is they're having a replication crisis themselves of not being able to replicate some of the research that was done earlier that we base a lot of our methods, our understandings on of human behavior, right? And the reason for that is because we evolve as humans, we evolve in our understanding, our environments, everything changes. And then also, a book I read, it's called Weird, and it's focusing mostly on, it's like Western, industrialized, rich, democratic societies, individualistic societies, right? And that's the basis of most of our research. When you look at it, it's 18 to 22-year-olds, mostly Caucasian, mostly middle to upper class, right? So that's going to produce significantly different psychological research. That's going to produce significantly different research in health and wellness and like all that stuff, right? I mean, for the longest time, there was a only going to do research on males. We're not going to do research on females, because when we did research on females, it started to mess up some of the reproductive systems and started having issues with that. So we were like, well, we're not going to mess with that anymore. Let's just strictly stick to males. So we spent 30, 40 years doing research on males, and now we don't have a lot of research on females, right? So we're constantly trying to evolve, and we have to understand those are the limitations of the research. So it's good to understand the research and the baselines that it produces, but then you have to understand you're dealing with humans on a day-to-day basis. So you're going to have to continue to evolve, and you have to have curiosity and creativity in your thought process to understand how to make those educated assumptions, I guess, educated guesses to what's the best fix.
Yeah, I always just refer to that as like the artful application of the science, because the individual is what's going to guide your decision making. And
Always.
you can't coach a program, you coach a person. So I love the fact that you mentioned the psychology of it, because I think you give the same thing to the same person at two different points in their life, you're going to get a completely different response from it. And I think a lot of that has to do with the psychological state of that individual and their readiness to accept whatever that intervention entails. And I think, that's enough science talk. I want to talk more about like even just the crux of what you're studying now. It's essentially like, how does doing hard things make us feel better?
Yeah, yeah. And especially when it comes to mental health disorders, right? I mean, the idea of hard things is going to be different for each individual person, and why they pursue those things and why they don't is going to be different for each individual person. But when you look at the neuroscience side of things and what we think causes depression, and what we think causes these mental health disorders, a lot of it has to do with our perception of stress, our perception of the memories that we have stored, and our ability to see if we have control of those things or not, right? And when you're dealing with somebody with mental health disorders, right, asking them to do hard things is asking someone that feels like they can't even make their own bed to like do something that is astronomically like unfeasible for them, right? So it's like, why do they have these thought processes of, I can't do this, I don't have control over this? And a lot of that has to do with deficits in memory and rumination and repetitive negative thinking, which is what my advisor looks at now. A lot of his research is on repetitive negative thinking, worry, rumination, and stuff like that. And when you look at why some of these treatments work and why they are effective, it's because you're getting plasticity within the brain, right? Psychedelics have been shown to improve depression and PTSD because it's helping to rewire these circuits in the brain. and not only allow them to rewire it, but it allows them to go back into their memories that are very hard for them um, to consider, because they are such traumatic experiences, because they are so down in the dumps about, the way they see themselves in the world, right? And this allows them to recreate those memories. Same thing with journaling, right? They've seen that if you journal for 15 to 30 minutes about a traumatic experience, and you continue to rewrite that journal expression in more positive words, you start to shift the way that you have that memory in your mind, right? So the thing with memory is we have these predictions and we have these errors. So we have this wealth of knowledge of things that we've gone through in life that form our memories. And then every time we see something that we don't think is supposed to be there, that's when that error occurs, right? So that's when your body and your brain reworks that into your memory. And so being able to rewrite things in a more positive light will start to shift that error into a more positive one instead of to a negative one, right? And that allows people to start to focus on the positive aspects of having control over their life, and what they can do. And why doing hard things is beneficial for that is much like the body, you have to push it into a realm that it's uncomfortable with in order to see adaptations. The brain is the same way. The brain grows. There's been plenty of research showing that with aerobic exercise in individuals, they saw increases in brain volume in the prefrontal cortex, in the anterior cingulate cortex. The prefrontal cortex is in charge of decision making, executive function. The anterior cingulate cortex is in charge of emotion regulation and things like that, along with the insula, right? Those are kind of like the three main areas that we think about when it comes to depression, along with the dopamine and things like that, right? And they've shown that by doing exercise, by doing things that are novel and things that you're not good at, that's where the hardness comes in. It's doing things that you're not good at, right? Not necessarily doing things that are extreme. It's doing things that you're not good at and then having the fortitude to stick with it. That creates this neuroplasticity, this enlargement, this growth in these brain areas that are attributed to depression, anxiety, PTSD, even attributed to an inability to make proper decisions, right? If you look at people who grow up in a low socioeconomic status household, right? Mothers who are having children in high stressful, low socioeconomic status, the kids have smaller prefrontal cortexes at birth and larger amygdalas. So they have a more heightened fearful response, but then they have a weakened ability to make the correct decisions. Right. And then that's why a lot of them lead to having troubles with the law, because their fear response gets heightened and their ability to make decisions appropriately. If you look at people who are in jail for violent offenses or on jail for death row, most of them have deficits in their prefrontal cortex. And all that has to go back to, the environment that they grew up in. So, you know, doing those hard things, doing things that you're not good at, those novel stimuluses continue to create that neuroplasticity in youth and also in older people as well. I mean, some of these studies are showing brain development and growth in 60, 70, and 80-year-olds. So
Wow.
clearly neuroplasticity and brain development continues to move forward as you age if you're constantly challenging yourself with new and novel things that you're not good at, right? So the people that espouse discipline as being able to kind of wake up and do what you're supposed to do on a day-to-day basis, that's not necessarily discipline in terms of the way that I look at it, right? I think discipline from the output of trying to improve mental health, improve that neuroplasticity, funny enough, comes from, like, Mike Tyson said that discipline is doing things that you hate, but doing it like you love it, right? So for us who exercise every day, we absolutely love it. So to espouse, like, we have better discipline because we're going to the gym, like that's crazy
That's,
talk, right? Like,
that's brushing our teeth.
right. Like, I'm trying to learn sign language and poetry, things that, like, I'm absolutely not good at all. And it's far easier for me to go days without doing that because it's hard for me to do. Right. So, yeah, I may look like I have discipline by going to run and bike and go to the gym every day, but that's like something I've been doing for 20 years. Ask me to do something new that I'm not good at. That's where the importance of discipline comes in. And that's where you start to get these novel adaptations of growth and brain development. And you start to see like higher quality of living, higher quality of happiness, less dementia, less Alzheimer's, and people that are constantly seeking that novel stimulus in a more appropriate manner.
The thing that I think about whenever I think about discipline is I too don't look at it as, oh, I have discipline because I do things every day that I might not want to do, so I do them. I think the way that I frame discipline for myself, for my clients, is the the habit of keeping a promise to myself, because that then builds the identity within me that I am someone who follows through and I can do these things on a daily basis and I want to be that person. So for me, discipline is it's a relatively easy concept to grasp because I know that the things that I choose to do are the things that make me better. And if I want to continue to get better, I should probably continue to do those things. And the other thought that I had while you were speaking was the concept of the hardest thing you've ever done is the hardest thing you've ever done. So when you were talking about memory and comparing memory and making these appraisals to the past, well, if the appraisal that you're making to the past, you have no concept of the relatability between the event you're currently going through and maybe past events, it's really challenging to understand that you do still have the competence to perform that task. I'm like relating it to my current situation. People, have mentioned like, man, this is going to be, the hardest thing you've ever done. I was like, mm, uh, emotional stuff is much harder for me to deal with than physical stuff. And I've been through much more challenging emotional situations. So to look at this as the hardest thing I've ever done, it's probably the hardest thing I've ever done physically, but physical things aren't as hard to me. So this is not the hardest thing I've ever done.
Yeah.
It's a lot easier to process that way, at least.
Yeah. And I mean, it's also like it's a very much a chicken and the egg situation, right? Where you've built this identity of this is who you are. You're a disciplined person. You're someone that can overcome obstacles, right? And this is something that, as long as I've known you, you've always had. Um, so it's more or less, are you contorting your life to fit your identity, as opposed to are you a disciplined person and therefore your identity grows because of that, right? Like if you look at the research on perceptions and belief and your ability to change that, that can shift who you are and what you get out of life as well, right? So the fact that you've told yourself that I am this type of person is going to allow you to become that type of person. Whereas opposed to somebody who's suffering with mental health disorders, like rumination, where they see themselves as someone who can't even get out of bed, right? Maybe they were disciplined in the past and now they self-identify as someone who is depressed, right? And therefore everything they do falls into that category of I am a depressed person, right? As opposed to maybe someone who has a little bit of a better perception of how they see themselves in the world. They may be seeing themselves as I'm not a depressed person. I'm someone who is going through a depressed time right now, right? So they don't identify as that depressed person, right? So you being able to identify as a disciplined person, I would always be curious whether or not if you've just always been disciplined or if you started to build this identity of being a disciplined person. Therefore, it's easy for you to become disciplined because you've convinced yourself that this is who I am, and then whenever you get pushback on that, does that create, an incongruence? Like do you create a cognitive dissonance once you get presented with something that's not that, right? And then that's when you get into these issues, right? When you're talking about like politics or religion, like things that people identify themselves with, when they get pushback on that identity, then they create a cognitive dissonance that doesn't allow them to see if that other person's making a legitimate point or an illegitimate point because you've identified as one person or this entity.
See, this is why I love talking to you, because it creates a different framework to kind of look at the things, especially now, the things that I've said or written and shared. Because one of the things that I said initially after the injury was like, I'm just someone who does hard things, and this is another hard thing that I will have to do.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to do it. And it was much, much more like a factor of acceptance of circumstance. Like I'm accepting circumstance and I'm going to move through it. And I have this memory from when I had the accident, hearing the pop, my knees hit the ground. I remember my knees hitting the ground, and then I remember my chest hitting the ground. It's like because I fell forward. And I remember feeling before my chest even hit the ground, I had already accepted what had happened. So I was completely calm. And I'm always curious as to the biochemistry that goes on in your brain during those times, because I'm obviously someone who can critically think. And it seemed to me like that critical thought happened like right away. Whereas some people, they fight circumstance, or they kind of resist what the world has presented them, and so they can't move through it. Is part of the research looking at maybe that disconnect where exercise can be the link between acceptance, because obviously, like, you're probably just so fucking tired that you have no other distractions other than like what you're doing, that you have to process these emotions. Like, what is that? What is going on within your study that you think is kind of taking place?
Yeah, so you bring up a lot of really good points. And the one thing I always try to caution people with is, the stories that we tell are very significant to us and us alone, right? And they'll either relate to people or they won't, right? Like a lot of people will talk about Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, and if you have a why, you can overcome any how, right? And essentially, people look at that and they espouse that like that's how everyone should be, right? But those are
Right.
the
Yeah.
Right. So those are the people. That's what Viktor Frankl had to convince himself of in order to make it through the concentration camp. But there's a lot of other people that have had success that maybe didn't have that ability to articulate it,
Mm-hmm.
but they still made it through, right? So we don't want to necessarily like just because you were able to make that instant critical thought doesn't necessarily mean everyone should have to do that in order for them to be successful, right? Everyone has their own way of processing things. Everyone has their own way of looking at things. That critical response may come later for other people or it may look completely different. So you always want to make sure that like what you're saying is very much indicative of you and the person that you've developed and became, right? Not so much as like everyone should follow in suit because this is the right way.
I made one of my reflections during my time. I think it was like right after we got home. I was talking about trauma and like the word trauma and how that's been kind of beat to death lately in a lot of instances. And obviously, this was a traumatic experience. It was a massive stress on my system. And if we categorize trauma as like a massive stress to the system, for sure it qualifies. But the post that I made was just a reflection on like, what if we stopped looking at trauma as a bad thing and just started looking at it as a thing and not trying to attach any meaning or putting any of our identity into it? And I got a lot of pushback from that. I got a lot of, especially because I alluded to the fact that yes, heinous things happen in the world, right? There are murders, there are rapes, all of these things are where people are victimized. But my thought, and obviously I've never been through either of those things, but I shouldn't say obviously, I just haven't been through either of those things. It takes a lot of processing to get from that victim place to that place of acceptance. And I think when I made that post, I didn't articulate well that I'm not judging others who don't process things the same way as me, or maybe don't process things as quickly as me, or process things differently than me. It was just me sharing my experience. And I had to kind of put that addendum to my post out because of all of the pushback that I got. I couldn't believe it that number one, I didn't feel like I was articulating as this is the way to do it, but that's how people were taking it. And I was like, that definitely not my intent. Dude, that's never my intent with anything I do. Training, nutrition, nothing. It's like, this is what could work. It might not be what works for you, but this is what I
Yeah.
do. Hey, sorry, we just had some technical difficulties, so we're going to pick back up. We're going to switch gears a little bit because it's something that I am very curious about heading into my retirement from powerlifting and not lifting heavy things. Tony's gone through that process and he shifted in a direction where I could not in a million years see myself shifting into, but he has. Um, Talk to me a little bit about the motivation to switch from powerlifting to more endurance and aerobic exercise.
Yeah, so I've always been enamored with the people who can really push themselves both physically and mentally. I was lucky enough to serve with 2nd Recon Battalion Special Forces in the Marines, and I got to meet some of the craziest human beings in the most positive way possible of saying crazy. And I was always very interested in like what made them special, what made them different. And I wanted something that not only pushed me physically, but also pushed me mentally. Jiu-jitsu is really great for that. But also these ultra endurance things are really good for that as well, because um, you're going to be put in situations where, every being in your body is telling you like, I don't really want to continue this. I can't continue this. I can't move forward. And it gives you that ability to problem solve, I guess. And that's why I also love, the research side of things and the work that I do is you're constantly trying to solve problems. And when you're out there and you're doing these long ultra endurance races, that's really what it comes down to is your ability to mentally process how you feel, and then think about ways of how you can overcome that. Is it a fueling deficit? Is it a mental barrier that you just had to push through? Is it hydration? Is it electrolytes? Like, are you going too fast? Like where's your heart rate at? So you're constantly trying to process and trying to solve these incremental like decisions each and every time, these questions that your body continues to arise as you go through these things. And there's a lot of gratification in that ability to understand your body and to push your body and to know that you're capable of more. So for me, it was mostly finding that area where I want to quit and doing something, and then do I decide to quit or do I don't decide to quit, and then how did I come to that decision? And that's why I like to do the things that I do, is like, because you're going to quit eventually on something's going to be very hard and you're just not going to be able to do it, even though physically you might be able to. And for me, that allows me an opportunity to grow. That allows me an opportunity to overcome a deficit that I have mentally and being able to not push through that. So it presents these challenges that I've self-imposed, obviously. And I feel like if you can constantly inundate yourself with self-imposed challenges in life, and then solve those, it's going to allow you to solve challenges that you don't get to choose in life a lot better, because you know that you've gone through these hard things before, and you know that as bad as this feels, as hard as this is, it's just a problem that you have to solve. And when you look at it that way, you're constantly solving problems instead of succumbing to them and thinking that it's unbearable, that you can't do it, right? So that's why I wanted to shift to that, because with training, with jujitsu, it's not so much that these are self-imposed limits that you're getting at, because with weights, the weights are always going to win. With jujitsu, you have an opponent, but when you're doing these ultra races, you're going at a pace that physiologically you should be able to maintain as long as you're hydrating and doing the right things, right, for a very long time. And by being able to do that, that's when you allow that mental component to come in. And that's really what I wanted to have, was more of a mental challenge than a physical one at this point in my life.
I remember you telling me when you decided to stop powerlifting, you said, well, I gave it a year of me doing everything, or I think it was a year of me doing everything I possibly could to get stronger, and I didn't get stronger. So at that point, you were like, the weights are winning. I made a joke to somebody who just came to buy some equipment here today because I'm selling my home gym. I was like, yeah, I got into this to find out how strong I could get, and I found it.
Yeah.
And it seemed like you were in a similar situation. Obviously, you didn't have any injury leading to it, but you kind of you found your strength limit, and that was something that you couldn't push against. So you talk about self-imposed limits. Like, it wasn't necessarily self-imposed because you did everything you could. There wasn't any other rock to flip. But I understand what you're saying about the endurance activity, because I actually used to say this to somebody that I was coaching who was competing in CrossFit, and she was doing burpees and she kept slowing down. I was like, you're not going to fail at a burpee.
Right.
Right. So as long as you keep moving, you can keep moving. And I feel like there's a parallel there with the running, right? You're not going to fail a step.
Right.
You could slow down. You could be walking, you could be crawling, but you'd still be moving forward. And that, to me, that is completely mental.
Yeah. And you quickly realize that, like, going through 100 miles, you're going to hit points where, when I started the first 30 miles, I was like at a 10 to 11 minute pace, cruising, and then I hit a rough patch where I was walking and it was like 20 to 30 minute pace, and then the last 20 miles, I was running at a 10, 11 minute pace again. Right. So you would think, like, hey, like, physically, you hit that wall, you start walking, you shouldn't be able to recover from that. But it definitely allows you to know, like, there's a huge mental component of what you're able to overcome and what you're able to push. And you can see the variety of ways of people dealing with that mental component when you're doing those races, because you have these checkpoints that you get to and your crew's there, and you see a bunch of people there, and some people are very positive about it. Some people are very emotional about it. There was a lot of crying. There's a lot of, like, why did I sign up for this? And even the people that are crying and why did I sign up, they finish as well. Right. And then some people don't. Right. And you're just constantly trying to find what it is that pushes you. Some people go with that David Goggins approach of, like, self-deprecation and, like, you suck. And some people with that, yeah.
Fucking
Some
hate
people with that more positive approach of, like, let's keep pushing. You're doing great. Right. And then some people are just more, trying to just solve problems and just trying to intellectually think about it. And you just have to find what works best for you. There's no right way or wrong way. And for me, within doing the research and looking at the stuff, it's a fun way to test those things too, of, like, what works for me, what doesn't work for me. And, now being able to explore that with the people that I work with, a lot of people come to me for concurrent training now and endurance stuff. And, you're able to see, like, hey, like, I did this with me. Let me know if it works for you. And they come back after a 20-mile run and they're like, no, this sucked. Like, what else do you have? And it's like, okay, let's try this. So you're constantly solving problems. And that's the thing that I love about it the most, is there's new problems you're going to face on a day-to-day basis, and mentally, how can you overcome those things?
So I'm reading a book. I'm reading Cam Haynes' book, Endure. He talks a lot about his running, and he talks a lot about his desire to push himself and find his limits. When do you know, or when will you know what your limit is, or what you are willing to endure to say that's enough?
When you say that's enough, man, like, it
Well,
gets,
for you personally, then.
I don't know. Cause I don't look at it like that. I don't look at it as like it's more just like a personal thing for me of, I'm pushing myself, not so much to, like, I
I'm
guess there
asking
is
the
a
hard
bit,
questions here. I'm asking the real hard questions, man.
yeah. I guess there is a limit, I'm trying to find, but it doesn't necessarily define me in terms of my accolades or my achievements. It's just something that, one, first and foremost, like, I enjoy it. So the moment I quit enjoying it is the moment that's my limit for sure, you know, and that's everyone's limit, and that's okay, right? Like, you can't do something forever and enjoy it. I think with someone like Cam and those people at that upper echelon, um, I feel like that's like a self-defining motivational belief for him, right? That's what makes him move. That's what makes him go. If you watch his Instagram stories, if you listen to him talk, like, that's the thing that defines him as a human being.
Yes, for
Is,
sure.
am I
Reading
able
the
to
book
push?
100%. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. For me, that's not so much something that truly care about defining me as a person. Um, it's more or less when I reach that limit, how do I how do I overcome it, or how do I succumb to it? And I take those as incremental like facts of knowledge base of like I succumb to this time. Like I've done 100 milers, I may quit on a 50 miler, and then I'll have to ask myself why, and then I'll get better because of that. So it's more or less not so much finding my limit as opposed to why was I successful versus why wasn't I successful, and then continuing to push to find those answers more so than anything else. And I think the people that are very successful in that sport are the ones that are pushing their limits. Like Courtney Dauwalter is one of the best.
Crazy.
Yeah, she's amazing. One of the most happiest go lucky person you'll ever meet. And she initially struggled with ultras because she had this negative valence towards pain, right? And every time pain came about, she found that as a marker of like, something's wrong with my body. I need to stop. And then she switched her mindset to having a more positive valence towards pain, where she was like, every time I get into this pain, she calls it a pain cave. She's like, every time I get into it, I try to dig as deep as I can, and it's fun for me. It's like a game for me. How far can I dig this time? And then every time I dig, I can go a little bit deeper and a little bit deeper. So for her, she's made it a fun game as opposed to a battle, right? So you just have to find what works best for your personality, and what you get out of it. And so for me, if I fail, I don't necessarily find that as a limit, because it's not going to stop. It's more of like, why did I do it? How can I learn from it? And that's why I do it. It's because I do want to hit that failure point as a learning experience, or I do want to hit that success point as a learning experience of why I was able to overcome it versus why I wasn't. And then just continue to build that toolbox of like psychological, mental abilities to overcome hard things. So for me, that's kind of my mindset when it comes to it, not so much the Cam Hanes approach.
I love that. I think I more so would resonate with you in terms of, the approach of like gathering data on myself and learning more about myself, and it being an exercise in self development
Yeah.
rather than finding limits. And I mean, I think there was a point in your life where you were into finding limits. I'm sure there was, because you don't do the things that you've done without having some of that in you. But and I would be the same. But there was a point, like the reason I stopped powerlifting 3 years ago was because it wasn't fun anymore.
Yeah.
When it stopped being fun, I pivoted and got myself to a place physically where I could have fun doing it again. Hence why I went to pursue it again. But I don't think it would be fun anymore. So I'm not going to
Yeah.
do it. And now I'm in a place, and I've been picking the brains of people who have, some of the people who have gone through similar injuries and continued to push. You think about like a Danny Tiniero, even Jaden Lacaria, who works for us now. They both torn quads, rehabbed. Danny said it took him 12 weeks just to get 30 degrees range of motion, and the guy's still squatting over 1,000 now. I'm like, that doesn't appeal to me at any level.
Yeah.
And so I'm searching for like, what's going to be the next way that I can physically push myself. And I definitely don't enjoy running at all. And I don't think it's anything that I would ever adhere to, but just kind of thinking in terms of like, what would be the next thing for me. And the closest I've gotten is I just want to be able to get on the ground and play with my kids
Yeah.
when the time comes. And I'm like, that's a pretty good goal for now. I
It's a
also want to
very,
be really intimidating to everyone else when I drop off my kids at school. That's,
yeah.
that's part of it. But
Yeah.
that's about as far as I've gotten.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm sure, like, as you talk to more and more people who have overcome these injuries, and some may have chosen to continue to pursue it, some may have chosen different routes, you'll notice that each one resonates with you a little bit, I'm sure. Just like the push and limits resonates with me, but that's not the driving factor, right? Like it's a pie chart, right? And every little bit makes up, why you do the things that you do. Pushing your limits is like a very small part of it for me. That's not something that like defines. And you'll probably notice that with you. Maybe for Danny, right? His bigger piece of his pie chart was like, I want to prove to myself that I can do this again, right? And maybe someone like me, I don't need to prove anything to myself because I don't know. I just have never had that, not in a negative way, but I've never had that ego drive to prove something to myself. I just don't really have that from a physical standpoint. From an intellectual standpoint, I have
I
that.
for sure have that intellectually for sure.
Yeah, yeah. And I think maybe that's because physically things have come a little bit more naturally to me, whereas intellectually, I never thought I'd be at the point that I'm at. And then you start meeting these people and you drive, like there's different drives based on what you're good at versus what you're not good at. And I think that that's the interesting part about learning psychology, meeting people, is like everyone has these drives that push us in our direction. Some people have everyone has negative drives. Everyone has positive drives. Some people lean more heavily into the negative ones. Some people lean more heavily into the positive ones. Like for me personally, I lean more towards the idea that I started late in this endeavor, so I'll never be able to fully accomplish everything that I want to accomplish. That I'm never going to be satisfied with. Did I make the change that I wanted to make? That I've never done enough, right? And that is what drives me. That's a negative drive that pushes me to do good, positive things within the research that I want to do. And then I have some positive drives as well. And everyone has their own way of doing things. And I think that that's the importance, is trying to find which one is you. And that requires introspection and self-awareness, right? It's not which one do I gravitate towards, the person on Instagram or social media. It's like, which one do I really think identifies with me? And that's the one that I'm going to lean into. And I think you have to continue to ask yourself those questions, because it's going to change with time, because you change as a person with time, right? So what you identified with in your 20s to 30s, I don't necessarily think you should be identifying with that in your 30s to 40s, because you're going to have this huge disconnect of who you are, what you were, and who you want to become, right? And if you're constantly trying to fight that battle of leaning back into what drove you when you were in your 20s, now that you're in your 40s, there's going to be a big disconnect, right? You want to have a family. That's going to be a bigger driving force for you in the choices you make physically, mentally, business wise, like all that stuff, right? So we need to continue to ask ourselves those questions, look inside, and continue to develop and evolve. And you'll notice that that dictates who you hang out with, who you spend your time with, like all those things. So I think those are the important things that you have to ask yourself. Is it's good to collect data from everyone, but don't necessarily be like, oh, he did it this way, so I'm going to do it that way. It's like,
Yeah,
yeah.
exactly. What are some of your favorite strategies that you've used and have good success with to do that introspective work?
Um, Psychedelics are definitely one way of doing that I've explored over the last 6, 7 years that have been very, very insightful. Therapy as well has been another one that's been very helpful, very insightful. Um, and then just reading, just trying to collect as much knowledge as possible in terms of reading. I'll read memoirs on people that have dealt with depression, people that have dealt with psychopathy, people that have dealt with all these mental health disorders, and reading their memoirs and understanding the tools that they've had, and reading psychology, reading therapy. Like, why do these things work? What are the mechanisms behind them? And just those are the things that make you think, like, read, journal about it, think about it, go on walks, like introspect. Don't necessarily always have something playing in your head. Meditation is another great one for me that I do, that allows me to connect my thoughts and dig a little bit deeper. But I think for me, the most impactful would be the first two, which would be therapy and psychedelics, and not together. I haven't done
You don't just get blitzed and go to therapy.
no, but that's what that's how they do the research on it, right? So I've never
Oh,
done, yeah, the interventions with psychedelics is they do them in a therapeutic setting. And that's where you really get a lot of benefits from psychedelics, is you have somebody guide you. That's why shamans are there. Shamans are able to guide you through your experience, which I think is very impactful and very good for certain people. And if given the opportunity, I would love to do that. I just never had that opportunity to do that due to the legality of psychedelics. But when you look at the research on psychedelics, those are all done in therapeutic settings with therapists that specialize in taking people through these psychedelic journeys to help them get through whatever it is they're trying to overcome at that point in time.
Very interesting. I personally have never experimented with psychedelics any more than like microdosing,
Yeah.
but even microdosing for me, just like if I microdose, and usually I use it for work because they make me incredibly productive. But
Yeah.
if I microdose and do some journaling or something like that, everything flows a lot more easily. I feel like there's less friction associated with my introspection. So I've definitely benefited a little bit, but there is still quite a bit of fear in me to go full bore and take a hero dose and dive down the rabbit hole. But
Yeah.
maybe one day, maybe
Yeah,
one
and
day.
that ability to introspect without that friction, and that for me, like I get a lot of that. I wake up pretty early in the morning, and what resonated with me, I found that it was very effective for me. But then I heard somebody talk about it. I think it might have been Stephen Pressfield, or somebody was talking about when you wake up early enough in the morning, you're able that inner critic inside of you is still sleeping. So you're
Yeah,
able to process things a lot better without having that inner critic tell you like you suck, you suck, you suck, you know? And
I've never heard,
psychedelics do
but that like that resonates deeply with me because I love my 5 a.m.s.
yeah.
I love being up at 5 a.m. before anyone's bothering me. I feel like everything is easier to accomplish. That makes total sense.
Yeah, and psychedelics it does the same thing. It what they talk about with psychedelics is that it dissolves the ego. So it dissolves that person who's trying to put on a front and protect you, right? But that protective mechanism is the thing that holds you back from really digging deep inside because it's scary to do that, right? So you just microdosing and being able to see the benefits of being able to dig a little bit deeper and have free flow creativity, that's exactly what you get out of that. Interestingly enough, when you look at the research, the microdosing research doesn't necessarily pan out to be as effective, if effective at all,
Interesting.
compared to the microdosing
The
or the macrodosing.
microdosing.
Yeah, yeah,
That's interesting. Yeah, I'm obviously this sort of subject I think is a bit polarizing for people because I've found there's very few people who can look at themselves and introspect without judgment.
yeah,
I think that right there is the key. And you talked about ego being that protective mechanism. To me, the ego is also the judgment piece that goes along with it. So even something like we'll just take again my because it's front of mind, like my current situation. I cannot have an ego because I literally can't care for myself. So I've had to, especially in the hospital when like I couldn't even wash myself. You can't have an ego and ask a nurse to wipe your ass.
right.
You can't. I tried. Can't do it. Can't do it. So I think most people go through their lives, and maybe I'm generalizing here, but go through their lives never truly appreciating how special they are because they never actually looked at it. They never peeled back the layers and looked at what are the motivations behind what they're doing. Are they actually happy? Or do they even know what happiness is for them? Because then if you don't know what happiness is for you, how do you actually take steps towards it or away from it? You can't.
Yeah, yeah, very. I mean, when you look at the happiness research, a lot of people, what they assume will make them happy isn't necessarily the things that actually make them happy, right? So, how do you understand that unless you actually dig deep and, try to find those things, right? Like, you talk to most people and they'll tell you that they want to live a meaningful life, a purposeful life, right? A lot of people do, not everyone, but then when you look at their day to day life and you ask them, did you live today with the meaning that you had in mind? A lot of people don't. A lot of people live their lives and socialize and have that connection. And what you find within the research of happiness is like, that's a lot of what makes people happy is that social interaction, that community, right? That's what creates true happiness in people because it gives you this feeling of kinship, of love, and those are the things that really drives happiness. It's not so much meaningful, purposeful life of accomplishments. It's more of a life filled with love, understanding, deep connection. Like those are the things that make people happy. But when you look at day-to-day life, most people are focused on accomplishments and money, and they think that that is the true meaning of happiness for them. And um, I think that disconnect creates a lot of problems with what people pursue in life and what they prioritize. And I think it's important to understand that deeply of like what makes you happy, what makes you the person that you want to be, and how can you get rid of some of the other things that you're striving towards that you think are important but don't necessarily make you happy. And that's hard to do, especially as you develop responsibilities, you develop all this other stuff that does require you to be successful and make money. But finding that happy median of asking yourself those questions and then pursuing the things that actually make you happy, I think that's where that real joy and spirit comes in. Because I mean, if you think about it, a lot of, and whether I'm right or wrong, it doesn't really matter. This is what I think when it comes to a lot of people say that we're driven through evolution based off of this drive to survive, right? This Darwin's survival of the fittest. But I think when you look at human species as a whole, evolution comes about through creativity and love, not so much through survival, right? Because if you think about the conscious experience, consciousness is not a survival mechanism for us as far as evolutionary goes, right? Evolutionary means of like what it means to be a person, what it means to be a self. That's not something that is survival of the fittest. That could be looked at as something that could be maladaptive in terms of survival of the fittest, right?
Is it a feature or is it a bug?
Right, right. So if you think about it in terms of we evolved through conscious beings and being creative and through love, to me that fits the description of evolution a lot more, right? Not so much of like who's the toughest, who's able to survive, what are these developments that we've created. It's like what is that creative process that allows us to continue to pursue and push towards meaningful relationships, meaningful drives, because you're going to be the most creative when you're doing things for the people that you love. You're going to be the most driven when you're doing things for the people that you love. So for me, with consciousness and with all that evolution, I think a lot of that is predisposed to love and relationships and trying to build those first and foremost, as opposed to just trying to create this body of survival and how can I be the most dominant person, as opposed to like I should just be the most loving and connected person.
I'm going to be the most loving, connected, dominant person.
Yeah.
Listen, man, I want to be mindful of your time. I know you mentioned you had some other things to do today, but if there was one lesson or one thing that you could leave the audience with today, what would it be?
Yeah, just be curious. Be curious about the people that you spend your time with. Be curious about yourself, and just really dive as deep as you can into that, and that'll give you the answers to live in a pretty happy and meaningful life for yourself and for the people that you surround yourself with.
I love that. I think it's a perfect place to end it, man. Thank you so much. Like you've been someone who I can always turn to give me the fucking truth. And, I've been grateful for your friendship over the years. And I really appreciate you being the first podcast back after this whole incident and to hear the cool things that you've been doing. And it's really amazing to see you just dive into things that you're curious about and passionate about. And you look really happy doing it.
Yeah, man, I appreciate you having me on. Always love talking to you, always love seeing you. And I'm glad you're in good mood and good spirits, buddy.
No other choice, man. Just be happy.
Yeah.
Appreciate it, man. Thank you everyone for listening. Please make sure to like, share, subscribe, and ring the bell for notifications. And we'll catch you on the next one.